Hello students and welcome back. I hope you have enjoyed your time off so far. This week, as we try to get back into some learning about American history, we're going to move on from talking about Thomas Jefferson, president number 3, and James Madison, president number 4, to talking about the next couple of presidents, the next 3 in fact. James Monroe was number 5. And John Quincy Adams was number 6, the son of John Adams. And number 7 was Andrew Jackson. So we'll be talking about them over the next couple of weeks. So this video, we want to talk about a few different things that were happening at the time of James Monroe's presidency. The first thing is, you can see from the slide here, that once the War of 1812 was over, the United States began to feel like a world power. And in 1816, just 2 years after the war was over, remember the war was over in 1814, James Monroe was elected as president number 5 of the United States. Monroe was from Virginia, just like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. So James Monroe becomes president in 1816, and he is immediately met with several things. The first thing was that there was a problem with the border. If you remember from earlier in the year, we talked about Pinckney's Treaty, which was supposed to settle the border between Spanish Florida and the United States, but there were still issues going on. So President James Monroe sends Andrew Jackson, who was in the military, and remember he was the hero of the Battle of New Orleans at the end of the War of 1812. He is sent by President Monroe to the border to settle this dispute. Well, when Andrew Jackson gets there, he decides instead of just settling the border dispute between Spanish Florida, Seminole Indians, and Americans, he's going to actually invade Florida on behalf of the United States. And Jackson does this without any orders from President Monroe. Here you can see the kind of the areas that were in dispute at the time, and Andrew Jackson ends up showing up to, here is the border, and he ends up showing up and then just going right on into Florida. And he eventually marches all the way down to the Spanish capital. And the result is that he removed the Spanish governor of Florida. Because he did so without orders from President Monroe, this is kind of a problem. He's kind of taking liberties that he didn't have to take. So Spain is in a position where they could potentially declare war on us. They could say, hey, you guys invaded us, that was an act of war, and we're going to declare war on you back. So this was a really bad spot that Andrew Jackson put President Monroe in. So what happens? Well, Spain decides that they don't want to risk a public worldwide war with the United States, and so they basically negotiate with the United States and say, look, we'll give you guys Florida, but you need to give us a few things in exchange. And they decide that they want $5 million, and they want a promise from the United States that we will not settle in Texas, which at the time is part of Spanish Florida. Well, we signed that treaty, and as you all know, we did not keep that treaty because Texas is part of the United States today. So at the same time that this is going on in the United States, you have something else going on throughout Central and South America. And that is that many of the countries in Central and South America began to rebel against the Spanish Empire. If you remember from 7th grade, you learned about the conquistadors and the Spanish conquistadors that settled much of Central and South America looking for gold and other things and enslaving Native Americans. Well, the Native Americans are beginning to rise up and fight back against the Spanish and try to get their freedom from the Spanish. And one of the main people that was leading this movement was a guy named Simón Bolívar. Simón Bolívar went around from country to country, basically leading revolutions to get the Spanish out and to bring the rule back to the people who were actually living there. And because of this, he was nicknamed El Libertor, or the Liberator. This is a picture of the Western Hemisphere, and you can see from here this picture that obviously includes the United States and what is modern-day Canada. Didn't exist at the time. Mexico, which was controlled by the Spanish at the time, and here's South America, much of which was controlled by the Spanish at this time as well. So James Monroe becomes president, and the thing that he might be known for the most is something called the Monroe Doctrine. And the Monroe Doctrine said several things. Number one, it said the United States basically said to the rest of the world that the Western Hemisphere, this area right here, was no longer available for European countries to create new colonies. And that was a big deal because, the European countries were still trying to, settle these areas. It also said that if European countries tried to make new colonies, the United States would consider that a hostile act against our country. A hostile act is basically like an act of war. So if any European countries tried to come over and make new colonies in any of these areas, not just the United States, but all of the Western Hemisphere, we would consider that an act of war against us. And so this was kind of a big deal. And it said to the rest of the world, the United States is ready to be a world player. We're gonna stand up for the area where we live, and we don't want any new colonies in this area. The people that live here should be able to control their own destiny. So, a couple of quick vocab terms. Nationalism is a term that means feelings of pride and loyalty towards a country or a nation. And then sphere of influence is something that refers to the area of influence that a nation claims control over. So if you think about sphere of influence this way, if Congress passes a law, we as citizens of the United States need to pass that law, which means that we fall under the sphere of influence of the United States government. But if Congress passes a law, does a Canadian citizen need to follow that law? Does a Spanish citizen need to follow that law? Does a Madagascar citizen need to follow that law? They do not, because they are not under the sphere of influence of the United States. And so you have a direct sphere of influence, like the United States, and then you have something called indirect sphere of influence. An indirect sphere of influence is the fact that when the United States does pass a law, the rest of the world pays attention to that, because we have an indirect sphere of influence. They don't necessarily have to follow that law, but they're paying attention to see what it is that we're doing. A couple more vocab terms. You have your sectionalism, was disagreements between different regions of the country, and this is going to become a big deal when we talk about slavery and the Civil War near the end of the year. Cumberland Road was the first road built by the government, by the federal government, and that road still exists today. It's Route 70. It travels from Washington, D.C. across Maryland and parts of Pennsylvania and West Virginia, and all the way to St. Louis, Missouri. You also have the Erie Canal built, and it basically linked New York City to Buffalo by water, and that was a big deal as well. Here's a picture of the Cumberland Road being built. You can see a number of different things going on here. The workers are on the road itself, kind of spreading the cobblestone out, and here you see several workers with hammers and chisels breaking down larger stones into smaller amounts. This guy seems to be the foreman or the guy in charge. He doesn't seem to be working real hard. And you can see the different other people working as well. These projects took years and years. They weren't built overnight. They took a lot of years to build as well. So the last thing we're going to talk about today is called the Missouri Compromise. And we'll come back to this slide in a second, but I want to talk about the Missouri Compromise for a second because the issue of slavery was becoming an issue. You had some states that were slave states, you had some states that were free states, and in 1820, Missouri wanted to become a state in the United States. They wanted to join the Union as a state, but they wanted to come in as a slave state. And the problem was, if they became a slave state, that would have thrown off the balance of slave and free states. It was very important to have the same amount of slave states as free states at the time, so that no one group could control the Congress and pass laws that favored their particular beliefs. So, with Missouri wanting to become a state and a slave state, that threw the balance off. So the compromise was this. They decided that Maine would also become a free state. So Maine, if you remember from earlier in the year, was part of Massachusetts. Maine now becomes part of the United States as a kind of breaks off from Massachusetts, so to speak, becomes its own state, and it becomes a free state. Missouri comes into the Union as a slave state, and then this number 3 is kind of a big deal. All future states would be slave or free based on whether they fell above or below the 3630 latitudinal line. So let's go back to this map a second. You can see all of the greenish yellow colored states were slave states. All of the orangish yellow colored states, these were free states. The greenish yellow were free states. The orangish yellow were slave states. Missouri comes into the Union as a slave state. Here's this line, 3630. It goes right across here and goes all the way out to here. And so in the future, all states above the line would be free, all states below the line would be slave. Well, you see a couple of problems already here. All of these states here were already above the line when they drew the line, but yet they were slave states. That wasn't as big of a problem as this. If you trace the line out along here, you see that the line goes right through the middle of this really big state. This is California. California wasn't a state yet, but when California became a state, this was going to be a problem because the line went right through the middle of California. So, all of these things that we talked about today fall kind of under James Monroe and John Quincy Adams' presidencies. And so this week, you're going to work on a couple of other different things that I'll put on Schoology, and you can check those things out. But if you have any questions about anything that we talked about in this video, or you have any questions about what the assignment is this week, please feel free to email me or message me on Schoology. I hope you have a great rest of the day.